All right, so to kick it off here, we're gonna do a vote. I'm gonna show you two pieces of code. They do the same thing, and you're gonna decide which piece of code does it expresses it in the most clean way. Which piece of code is the most clean? We'll do it by a raise of hands. Okay, so look at it, read it. I'll give you a minute. Okay, which piece of code is more clean? A, raise your hand for A. Raise your hand for B. Okay, great. All right, ooh, which one is clean? All right, read it. Which one's A? Okay, now how about B? All right, great. We're about 50-50 for each one. What does this block of code do? You can go ahead and just yell it out at me.
It's parsing the
All right, we got a user agent. All right, cool. How many of you, by a show of hands, have heard this phrase? You don't need comments if you write clean code. Yeah, almost everybody. So this is where I think a lot of misconceptions lie. In the book, Clean Code by Robert C. Martin, he talks about how comments shouldn't be necessary because code should be self-documenting. That if you feel a comment is necessary, you should rewrite it to be more legible. I both agree and disagree with this. In the process of writing a comment, you can often find things that could be written better, but it's not an either or. I might still be able to rewrite that comment to be more self-documenting and also write a comment as well for the following reason. Code can describe how, but it cannot explain why. Now, this isn't a new premise at all, but it's a common theme that I see in helpful comments that I've come across. The ability to communicate something that code can't or can't precisely. And all of that said, there's not just one way or correct way to write a comment. I believe that our collective discourse about code comments is far too shallow. There are good comments and there are bad comments. They can make our code bases more legible and they can mislead us. They can guide us and they can be a crutch. So for that reason, today, we're gonna be talking about the art of code comments. I'm Sarah Drasner. I'm a Vue core member of Vue. I also am head of developer experience at Netlify, which is neither Netflix or Shopify, as confusing as it is for my parents. It is a really awesome way to deploy sites and apps that I love. That's why I asked them if I could work there. So I'm really pleased to be with you all today, especially in Hawaii. I'm sure we all appreciated the Gap Day yesterday. That was awesome. So I mentioned there's some nuance to this. There's good comments and there's bad comments. So we're gonna go over both of them. We're gonna start with the good comments first. What is the why? Many examples of good comments can be housed under this category. Code explains what you'd like the computer to take action on. And you'll hear people talk about declarative code where they're saying, rather than imperative code where things are steps in a recipe, you're basically telling the computer what you want it to do and the computer does the heavy lifting. Well, our comments can also be more declarative. We had to write this function because the browser interprets everything as a box. This code doesn't describe what the code below it will do. It doesn't describe the actions that we'll take. If you found a more elegant way of writing this, you'd feel confident that you could refactor it. And because of this, less maintenance is required in order to keep these comments around. So if you found a better way to write this, you probably wouldn't have to rewrite this comment. I think the funniest version of this is from the former manager of React Core, Sophie Alpert, posted this. This comment is longer than the README to some of my repos. The only piece of code is that tiny little bit at the bottom there. But this, all of that explanation was really necessary. Why? Because it was a particularly nasty bit of code and bug that she spent a really long time debugging. And so it wasn't very straightforward, and just that one line of code doesn't express all of the things that that one piece of code does. It can also clarify what's not typically legible by humans. Remember the user agent thing that we saw before? That wasn't super legible. What about this? Does anybody know what this does? Right. Does, does anybody know what this does? Probably not. This targets Firefox versions 2 to 3. This targets Chrome, Safari, and Opera. I've written code that needs something like this. And in order to avoid another maintainer or future me, assuming I took some mushrooms on the way to work, it's great to tell people what the heck that's for. Especially in preparation for a time when you no longer need it. Maybe they solve that browser issue, or maybe you're not supporting that browser anymore and you can remove it. Who's smart? We are. Who writes clean code? We do. But you don't have to comment, look at how clear your code is, but think back to that first exercise we did. We weren't all on the same page about what was clean. The room was divided at 50-50 on what was clean and what wasn't. People don't always agree on these things, and it can be really subjective. And you can always assume that what you're doing is the most clean way of representing it. But that even changes over time. The code that I think was clean 5 years ago is not what I think is clean today. And you level up in different ways. Another thing is that we're all knowledgeable in different ways. If you're on a team where everybody's skill set is more tightly knit, you might have more overlaps for what you think is clean. You might be more on the same page. So maybe this isn't as much of an issue. But on a team where the skill sets are more of a Venn diagram, you might not have the same opinions, might not have the same background, and that's okay. It might look like I'm advocating for the smaller skill set circle, but look at how much more ground this covers. You have a larger spread of expertise when you have a team that looks like this. Or say you get junior developers on your project. On bigger teams where you have a lot of junior developers and engineers from all types of backgrounds, people might not outright tell you that they need you to comment, but a lot of times they'll express gratitude when you do. Comments can be like chapters of a book. If you think of a book, it's the same amount of information whether you have paragraphs or chapters or indexes, but we split those up. Why? So that you can skim easier, so that you can pick things back up if you've been gone from time away. And that's true of our code too. Commenting or sections of code allows people to get to the piece that's most relevant to them. But you might say, we have imports and modules and functional programming. Absolutely, that is awesome, and I'm so excited about that. But necessarily, there's gonna be a time when you get to a larger piece of code that just has to exist. Sometimes commenting different sections or making some separation can help people find their way more quickly. A guide to keep the logic straight while writing the code. Sometimes I do this thing where if I have a big project where I'm managing a ton of state from a bunch of different things, I'll write something like this out. Get the request from the server, give us an error if it failed, do X thing with the request, format the data like so, and so on and so forth. Just making a long to-do list of little sections so that I can break down my tasks. Now, these are a weird one because these aren't the kind of comments you want to keep around. If you keep them around, they can be misleading, and we'll get to that in a minute. But they're really helpful while you're writing the code so you can break your tasks down into smaller bits. So in the process of writing all of this code, it can be really helpful to write it like this, but then you should probably remove it, because when left in your code as is, these comments can be a little screwy to read later. My perfect world suggestion would be to use these comments at the time of writing and then revisit them after. As you delete them, you can ask yourself, does this do this in the most elegant way that I could? Is there another comment that I could write that might explain why this is necessary? What would I think is most useful to express to another from another mother? This is okay to refactor. Now, this is an interesting one. This isn't my best work, but we had to get it in by the deadline. How many of you have had a really aggressive product deadline? Most of you. Okay, maybe you implemented a feature that you yourself disagreed with, and you were like, I don't know about this, and they were like, oh, don't worry, it's an A/B test. Or don't worry, don't worry, it's just temporary. And then it lived on forever, ever, ever, ever. Cue horror music. As embarrassing as it is to write a comment like this, sometimes it's super helpful. As a maintainer, if I come across a comment like this, I'm not thinking like, what's wrong with this person? How can I sabotage their morning commute? I'm thinking, I'm thinking, okay, I know that they were probably under a lot of pressure and it's okay for me to refactor. I don't even spend that much time thinking through their process. I'm all about like, all right, let's get in the mode where I can improve on this. So that can be really helpful for a maintainer. I will say, don't use this as a crutch though. You can't just put this on every block of code and call it a day, right? But it can be helpful to let other people know what's going on. Commenting as a teaching tool. Are you a node shop that's been given a client that's all Ruby? Maybe it's totally standard Ruby, but everyone's in a little over their head. Are you writing a tutorial for someone? These are limited examples when writing out the how can actually be helpful. The person is literally learning on the spot and might not be able to just infer something because they've never seen that code before in their lives. Comment that shit. Learning is humbling enough as it is without them having to ask aloud what they could more easily infer on their own. Commenting doesn't just have to be a teaching tool either. This person did a really cool thing where they held themselves accountable for a tutorial by commenting above every line of code exactly what it was doing. That's awesome. He's holding himself accountable for learning that material line by line. So it can be a way for you to also, keep yourself accountable for what you're learning and teaching as well. I Stack Overflowed the bejesus out of this. Did you just copy a whole block of code from Stack Overflow? Okay, we've all been there. Something that I've done that saved me in the past is to put a link from where I got it, where I found it. And sometimes people say to me, but then I don't get credit for writing that code. And I would tell them, you're optimizing for the wrong thing. Inevitably, people have different coding styles. And this is important because what if you level up later? What if you're smarter later on and you revisit this block of code and it's in a completely different style than you're used to and you actually know more? You might spend a lot of time sitting there going, wait, why did I write it like this when I know X is true? Another thing is Stack Overflow has got a lot of traffic. You might go to that post later and find out there's a better response. That happens all the time. So this is a really good way for you to keep track of those things as you move forward. Comments can be really helpful. April Wenzel wrote this really awesome post called "It's Time to Retire RTFM." And this is why I think it's useful to add these comments sometimes. She makes a really good point in this that in tech, we get comfortable with a sort of survivorship bias. And what I mean by that is, well, I had to go through it, so you have to go through it too. But the job of a senior engineer, the job of a more advanced engineer is to make sure that the other team can scale efficiently. The job of a senior engineer is to make sure that everyone else can get going and be as productive as humanly possible. And sometimes comments can help with that. And that means helping. Not leaving people on their own if you know the path. All right, let's segue into the bad. Writing comments gets a bad rap sometimes, and that's because bad comments exist. So let's talk about some ways that we can avoid doing this while writing them. They just say what it's already doing. I think a lot of people get frustrated because they see comments like this. Stuff like this is a big pain. Why? Because you're reading the same thing twice in two different formats. It gives you no more information, and in fact, it makes you process things twice. It's mental overhead rather than helpful. I've written comments like this, but for whatever the reason, you have to take a step back and be honest with yourself and acknowledge that this comment isn't helpful from a reader's perspective. It wasn't well maintained. Bad documentation can be worse than no documentation. There's nothing more frustrating than coming across a block of code where a comment says something other than what the code beneath it does. And I think that really frustrates people, and they tend to get in the comments are bad area. But the comment is in your code. It's your job to work on it, even if it means deleting it. So I think sometimes people see comments and they're like, well, that's optional. That's not, I'm working on the code. I don't really have to, mess around with the comments here. But the comment is literally part of your code, and you're also trying not to, mess up the people who come after you. So even if you disagree with code comments and you see a code comment, just get rid of it if you don't want to maintain it. Otherwise, you should be maintaining that along with the code. If you don't, it's worse than time wasting, it's misleading. It can lead people down the wrong path. If you write your code to be good quality to begin with, that express the why and not the how, you might find that the maintenance issue actually goes away. So if we say, we need to use the flip technique to be more performant in every browser, if you switch the code from using get bounding client rect to get bbox, which do similar but different things, because you didn't write out the how, you're not gonna have to rewrite everything. You're actually using the same thing because that comment is expressing the why. So then you don't have to refactor the code comments as well if you write really clean code comments. Hoarders, but for code. You changed something. You changed something. You know you like the new code, but you just can't quite get rid of that old code yet. This one's tricky because if you're not sure if you're done yet, it's okay to keep these in because maybe you do need to keep it in and use it again later. But hopefully you're all working with version control and you're all writing good commit messages. So those comments, those pieces of code that you're commenting should be retrievable for you. You should be able to look back at the thing that you refactored and be able to see what you refactored and retrieve them. If you don't, and you move away from the project in the future you or your future teammates will spend a few minutes trying to figure out what went on here. Do we need this? Will we need this? It's time wasting to do this to people. Trust your instincts and your version control system. Get rid of it. You could have used a better name. I've done this before. I've definitely seen a lot of other people write code like this before, where the variable or functions names are one letter, and then you comment what the thing is earlier in the file. This is a waste. I know we all hate typing, but if you're using a variable or a function name repeatedly, I don't want to scan up the whole document where you explained what the name did, where you could just use the name precisely. I can read this code now. Previously, I couldn't. If I go back here, but if I look at this, okay, I know what everything does right away. That's much more useful and much more legible. And if you're writing those comments to explain what a name can do, you're not naming correctly. I love this tweet by Mike Kerr. I like the rule in functional programming that if it's hard to name, perhaps you're giving the function too much responsibility. Refactoring has helped me name, and likewise, trying to name has also made my function smaller. The comments are an excuse for not writing the code better to begin with. And this is the crux of the issue for a lot of people. If you're writing code that's haphazard and you're leaning on your comments to clarify, this means the comments are holding back your programming. This is a kind of horse behind the cart scenario. And unfortunately, even as the author, it's kind of hard to distinguish which is which when you're really getting going on a project. We lie to ourselves in myriad ways. We spend time writing a comment that could be better spent making the code a little cleaner to begin with. We might also tell ourselves, we don't need to comment our code because our code is so well written, even if other people don't agree. Just do your best. There's not one true way when you're writing comments. It's not no comments or yes comments. It's thoughtful comments that are good for the maintainer to read. Try to envision that you're both the author and the reader when you're looking at that code. When you're writing your code, you're both the person writing it and the person maintaining it in the future. What information do you need to be as productive as possible? What would a younger you need? It said that 30% of time, a developer's time is spent writing code and 70% is spent reading code. My suggestion would be to spend a moment after you think you're done with a project and review with commenting and legibility in mind. And I'll even submit PRs to myself when I work alone. I work alone on a lot of open source projects. I learned this from Stacy Cavernmo, and it really helps me evaluate that code from new eyes. I write it as the person who's just trying to get the stuff done, and then when I submit the PR to myself, I read it as a maintainer and someone who has to maintain the code later. I encourage this practice. More than one thing can be true at a time. People tend to get on one side or the other of whether or not you should write comments, but I would argue that the conversation isn't really nuanced enough. Why not both? Hopefully opening the floor to a deeper conversation about this can help you write more meaningful comments, and it bridges the gap. Even so, it can be a lot to parse. Get it? Parse? Anyways, I'll leave you with some better humor. A while back, there was a Stack Overflow post where people wrote the best comments that they've ever seen, and you can definitely waste some time in here. Here's some of them that I thought were really good. When I wrote this, only God and I understood what I was doing. Now, only God knows. I dedicate all this code, all my work, to my wife, Darlene, who will have to support me and our 3 children and the dog once it gets released into the public. Drunk, fixed later. First dev, images are deleted by GDI+. Second dev, I'm not sure about that. Some dev 1, adding temporary tracking of login screen. 5 years later, temporary links. I'll leave you with this example that I particularly like from Kelly Vaughn. She tweeted this out saying, sometimes you need to be your own cheerleader. If you can't read it, it says, this is not a useful comment, but you are useful, and you can do this. That's true for all of us, too. Thank you so much.